For a century, the Titanic has been hidden in darkness, nearly 4 kilometers down at the bottom of the Atlantic. Now, a new investigation is about to drain the ocean, pull the plug of the Atlantic, and reveal the wreck. The Titanic, as she hasn't been seen since she sailed on her first and final voyage in 1912. We see her before and after to learn the truth about the ship of dreams and nightmares. And in the bright light of day, we uncover critical new evidence we thought had disappeared with the ship. From giant gouges on the ocean floor to damage from the iceberg that sliced her open. A team of scientists equipped with cutting-edge tools now tackles the long-standing mysteries of the disaster that could rewrite the Titanic's story. Drained dry, this is the wreck of the Titanic as you've never seen it before. It's the most infamous ship in all history, the Titanic. From a time when ocean liners are racing to be the biggest, fastest, and best, the RMS Titanic is a technological marvel. When she set sail in 1912, she's the largest moving man-made object on the planet. An unsinkable ship.
The Titanic was the largest and the most luxurious ship to ever sail. It was on its maiden voyage. It had very wealthy people, very poor people, people from all walks of life, a microcosm of the world.
But around 4,000 kilometers into her maiden voyage, disaster.
This ship that was supposed to be unsinkable struck an iceberg in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, and within about 2.5 hours sank beneath the waves.
Passengers and crew sank to the icy depths. And more than a century later, we still don't know exactly what happened that night. How she sank and broke apart. Hundreds of passengers and crew witnessed the tragedy and lived to tell the tale. Yet countless unanswered questions remain.
We have lots of historical information, but often there are biases in those historical accounts. Even the eyewitnesses of the sinking of Titanic had many different perceptions of how that sinking took place. So the best way to unravel some of those questions is to use science.
Explorers first discovered the Titanic's wreckage in September 1985.
The boiler!
Since then, more than 20 expeditions have gone back to the ship. 4 kilometers down, this is a place as alien as the surface of the moon. Only a few meters of the Titanic's hull are visible in the explorer's headlights at any one time. Nobody's ever been able to see the whole wreck, or even find the edges of the site.
In the past, trying to understand Titanic with the existing technology was like trying to draw a map of downtown Manhattan. From the height of a 10-story building in a vehicle that has the windows fogged up, it's pitch black, and you're trying to look at it through a flashlight. Challenging, to say the least.
Critical clues to understanding the disaster still lurk in this darkness. Now, a team of scientists funded by the legal steward of the wreck, RMS Titanic Incorporated, are set to change all that and bring the Titanic into the clear light of day for the first time. They're conducting an epic, high-tech investigation to discover exactly how and why she sank. The Titanic Mapping Project. The mission: use cutting-edge sonar mapping technology to scan every part of the wreck and build a precise digital model of the Titanic. As she sits on the ocean floor, their data will allow us to virtually peel back the sea, strip away trillions of liters of the Atlantic Ocean, and 4 kilometers down, reveal the unsinkable Titanic, drained dry on the ocean floor. But scanning the deep ocean isn't easy. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, have to dive down through 3,600 meters of water.
It's incredibly challenging to work at Titanic. It's dangerous. It's a very dangerous place.
Investigators program the AUVs to fly as close as 10 meters above the wreck. The underwater drones then fire signals, measuring variations in height down to the tiniest detail. They crisscross the wreck and seabed, like mowing a gigantic lawn. Each pass scans a 50-meter wide strip, gathering millions of data points. Next, the team deploys an ROV, a remote-controlled sub attached by cable, to capture thousands of digital images of every point on the wreck.
Every single day, these vehicles would come back with some new bit of information about what was on the bottom.
A tidal wave of new data comes to the surface. More than 160 hours of video. In total, 37 terabytes of data. But to see what they've got takes time. Over the next weeks, banks of computers crunch the raw data, turning millions of sonar points into a complex model of the wreck.
I remember all of us sort of sitting around the computer when we first were building the 3D layer and seeing the bow and seeing the stern in so much detail. We were all sort of grinning at the screen, looking at all that data, and seeing that for the first time was pretty amazing.
At the same time, visualization expert Bill Lang begins stitching together thousands of individual images of the wreck. A task that takes him and his team at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution 6 months to complete.
It was a very long and tedious process. There were over 200 other mosaics that were done for site interpretation and future archaeological work.
This ultra-high-def imagery, together with the 3D scan, can now unlock a new vision of the Titanic, a wreck that's been shrouded in darkness for over a century. It's been 4 years in the making. But now we can strip bare an extraordinary landscape, pull the plug from the Atlantic. Nearly 4 kilometers down, giant walls of steel tower into the sky. Sunlight hits her decks once more, and countless clues to the disaster start to emerge. This is the drained wreck of the Titanic. Grave of 1,500 souls. For the first time in over a century, we can see the Titanic in its entirety in unprecedented detail. Now, investigators can map out the site's boundaries, and archaeologists can get an overview of a wreck that's been hidden since that fateful April night in 1912.
It's almost like the fog has been cleared away. We can now start to see through the perpetual darkness.
The idea of draining the Titanic presents the site in a whole different light. It's not impenetrable. It's right there in front of us to explore.
The Titanic's wreckage is spread out over 1.5 square kilometers of the exposed ocean floor, an area of some 200 football fields.
The site of RMS Titanic can be described pretty basically as two large features: the bow section and the stern section, which are about a mile apart, and then numerous debris fields.
In all, there are 5 debris fields, each scattered with fragments of the ship and objects that tumbled out as she sank. The stunning vistas unleashed by the new model bring the Titanic back to life.
People think science is above emotion. You know, when you're looking at the boat deck where you know so many people said goodbye to one another, these are important points on that ship.
The guardrails where on that freezing night, fathers hugged their children, set them in the lowering lifeboats, and leaned out to catch a final glimpse of their loved ones. Portholes where passengers trapped below deck saw the starry sky for the last time as the ship slipped beneath the waves.
There's something about that ship for everybody. It pulls at you, it draws, it gets into your very spirit. Very sad, heart-tugging things, families saying goodbye, lovers saying goodbye. People giving up their seats in lifeboats so that other people would live. It's just amazing.
And even the mast of the Crow's Nest, where lookout Frederick Fleet's voice shattered the silence of the night as he first spotted the looming iceberg.
The telemotor where Robert Hitchens stood and spun that wheel in a vain attempt to avoid the iceberg. To the scattered wires and switches that once were flicked to close the watertight doors.
And with the ocean now drained dry, her enormous bow section towers above the seabed.
Despite the violence of the sinking and all that time on the bottom, what's inside that bow in particular is still a ghostly sense of the ship that was.
Inside the bow were many of the most luxurious of the ship's features. The grand staircase, running the height of 5 decks. The heated swimming pool, reserved for first-class passengers only. And a state-of-the-art gym, positioned right up on the boat deck. The model reveals just how intact this section of the ship really is. Embedded in the exposed ocean floor, almost perfectly upright, the ghostly shell of the Titanic seems to be sailing across the seabed, her prow parting the mud almost like water. With 12 meters of the bow above the ocean floor, a full 20 meters must be buried, equivalent to a 6-story building. Using the depth to which it is carved into the seabed, investigators are refining their calculations of the impact speed.
Its descent was very smooth. It had its aerodynamic nose facing into the direction of travel. So there was no tumbling. It was not particularly violent until the very last moment.
Once separated from the rest of the ship, the bow sank first at about 55 kilometers per hour at an angle of 15 to 30 degrees. Its impact with the seafloor was like a gigantic 28,500 metric ton truck slamming into a snowdrift.
When the bow finally reached the bottom, it plowed in to the dirt almost all the way up to the anchors.
The investigation is still probing the data, hoping to learn more about how the bow reached the bottom. And the fact that the bow's intact means that they can also examine the most iconic mystery of the Titanic: the iceberg impact. The official 1912 accident report seems to suggest the iceberg tore a gigantic 100-meter gash in the ship's right-hand side, ripping open over a third of her entire hull. However, eyewitness records proved the Titanic took around 2.5 hours to sink. Investigators are puzzled. A 100-meter hole would surely have sunk the Titanic in a matter of minutes. Oceanic explorer P.H. Nargeolet has made 30 trips 3,600 meters down to the Titanic, but he's never seen a 100-meter gash.
We were trying to find where the Titanic hit the iceberg, why it was like that, why we saw some crack, why there is a crack here and not here.
Nargeolet and the team now turn to the ultra-high-resolution photomosaics of the wreckage to see what evidence there might be. This profile view of the bow is stitched together from over 3,000 individual images.
The profile mosaics show Titanic in a way that people hadn't seen it before. No one had done a profile view of Titanic's bow in the 25 years that people have been going to Titanic.
Here again, even with these pen-sharp images, they find no sign of anything approaching a 100-meter tear on the hull. Instead, when they turn to the video footage, investigators can see much smaller areas of impact damage.
They designed it to take a hit, but it was more a head-on hit. They didn't design it to take a blow that would just open it up like a knife. It was really a stoving in against the hull that popped the rivets. Remember, she wasn't welded, she was stapled together. And that was the technology of the time, and the staples broke.
The actual iceberg damage appears to be confined to maybe a 30-foot length of the bow. It wasn't like a gash, and it wasn't tens of small gashes.
The size of these gaps in the hull add up to just 1 square meter. A breach this size would allow 1,400 liters of seawater to gush in every second. And when they analyze how quickly this would have sunk the Titanic, it turns out to be 2.5 hours. Exactly the time the ship actually took to sink. It seems an enduring mystery is solved. But for the team, there's an even bigger question looming that our new model could shed light on. When and where was the ship torn in half? How did her bow become separated from her stern by a staggering 600 meters? The answer is here, in broad daylight, on the drained seafloor, in the exposed wreck of the Titanic. This is what the Titanic looks like today, without 4 kilometers of pitch-black ocean blocking out the sun. 600 meters beyond the massive bow section, in the heart of the debris fields, lies the dismembered stern, the back end of the ship. It's the second largest fragment, 120 meters long. But it's immediately obvious that it's in very different condition than the bow.
The stern is a mess. It looks like it's been ripped up like confetti.
The stern today is pure chaos.
Some of the stern's huge metal components are still intact, like the 12-meter-high engines, each the size of a large house. But our highly detailed model also shows decks collapsing, as if crushed together. Heavy steel beams twisted and torn like straws.
It's hard to figure out what you're looking at. To me, it almost looks like a giant piece of metal sitting on the seafloor, but tough to make it out as a piece of a ship.
Why is it in such bad condition? Investigators have struggled to fully explain this. But within the model, there's a vital clue, something that could unlock the stern's violent story.
On the acoustic map, you can see that the stern was turning counterclock.
It's a massive mark carved into the seabed when the stern made impact. Scientists can now read the tracks and interpret how the stern hit the sea floor.
You can see very well when the stern hit the bottom, the stern was still turning, and you can see the bottom of the ship on port side, showing that the stern was turning in the same time.
The marks allow investigators to work out the speed of impact. It turns out that the stern was moving through the water at 80 kilometers per hour. Massive forces from chaotically whipping through the ocean at such speed help explain why the stern is so badly damaged. While the hydrodynamic bow sliced cleanly through the water and remained largely intact.
If you have a plane that's damaged in flight, the air will get under the skin of the plane and rip pieces off.
The same thing would likely have happened with the Titanic's rapidly disintegrating stern.
At first, large chunks came off, and then once the structure resisted, small pieces like confetti started to fly away.
Investigators think high-pressure water may then have found a route into the ship's internal structure, slamming into its interior walls.
Once the hull is separated from the frames, water will blast through. It'll form a ram. All those interior walls were wooden, and they didn't stand a chance. The water started coming through at full force. They were pulverized.
To the team, this is more evidence for why the stern now looks like a massive car wreck. While the bow section remains intact, it's another answer to the mystery. The investigation has now clarified how the two main sections of the ship reached the bottom. It's also shown how they impacted and why they look so completely different. But there's still one major question to tackle. How and when did the Titanic break apart? Between the Titanic's bow and stern, a massive debris field stretches out for hundreds of meters. It's a scene only oceanographers have witnessed before. At the bottom of the sea, in almost total darkness. Now, basking in the light of the sun, it's easy to see every piece, each a potential clue in solving the mystery of how and why the Titanic broke apart. For years, the dominant theory has been that she split in two on the surface. As the sinking bow angled down, lifting the stern high into the air, its own unsupported weight became too much. The ship snapped in half. But with the ocean now drained away, new clues are emerging that could challenge that theory. By looking at the pattern in which the debris fell to the ocean floor, investigators can retrace the way it fell from the ship. They'll use this forensic record to get an accurate picture of how and when the boat was torn to pieces. But getting the answer will require a massive effort. The team must scan all the new underwater data to ID and tag the position of as many objects as possible, and build a massive digital map of the artifacts from the ocean floor. It includes the positions of the 5,000 or so objects previous expeditions have recovered from the wreck.
What we've come to understand is that for the most part, everything you see scattered around there and on the bottom rained down as the bow and stern came apart and settled in different places on the seafloor.
It's a catalog of treasures, ornate statues from the ship's grand stairway, chandeliers that once hung in the first-class smoking room, the finest crockery from the ship's best restaurant. There's even one of the Titanic's bronze bells, and pieces of nautical equipment from the docking bridge. Every precious object is a critical data point and could help explain for certain how the ship came apart.
The patterns that are emerging from this remapping of the site don't fit any of the traditional models that were there before.
The work will take years to complete.
There's coffee cups, dinner plates, bits of chandeliers, deck benches. It's full of objects from the ship, but also personal objects as well.
For me, the artifacts that have spoken powerfully are the ones associated with people. A steward's jacket, crumpled lying on the seabed with his name inked on the collar, and that survived. Shoes on the bottom.
Each data point on the map is also a story in itself. A touchstone that reveals a detail of a human life. Some artifacts are highly personal. Delicate jewelry that may once have graced the neck of a society lady. And perfume bottles with their alluring scents trapped inside.
It's just a very beautiful, very emotional moment just to see everything lying there on the ground. It's a visual story of that tragedy.
Oftentimes, history swallows up the ordinary folks. All of us, we just tend to go away. Archaeological sites give us an opportunity to correct that.
Now that the investigation has defined this ghostly place as an archaeological site, it will help protect the Titanic story for generations to come. Each of the priceless artifacts is part of a mosaic of tragic stories that together form a picture. A picture of 2,200 souls who shared one terrifying night that has fascinated us for over a century.
It remains a universally horrifying and yet appealing story that we are ever compelled to look at.
Even after all these years, questions remain.
There's a mystery of how exactly the ship did sink. You know, did it break up in two on the surface? Did it break in two on the way to the bottom?
The fully mapped debris field is at last ready to give investigators the crucial answer they've long been waiting for. When and where the Titanic broke apart. In the 2.5 hours it took the Titanic to sink, over 700 people made it off the ship and into lifeboats. But in the chaos of the moment, it was far from an orderly process.
On the earliest lifeboats, people still couldn't really believe that that big ship was going to sink. As the evening progressed and things got more and more dire, then you had men almost fighting to get aboard the lifeboats.
You can almost imagine people crowding there and thronging and weeping as the boats were loaded, and the realization was that there wasn't room for all.
The rest of them remained on ship just awaiting their fate, whatever that might be.
Hundreds of those who survived witnessed the sinking. Yet there's always been disagreement about how and when the ship broke apart.
There are still different theories and arguments as to how things exactly happened when the ship tore in two.
Now, some investigators think the new data could prove once and for all what really happened. In recent years, the dominant theory has been that the breakup occurred while the Titanic was still on the surface. We know from eyewitnesses that the stern tilted up out of the water as she sank. Some experts have argued this created immense stresses, tearing the ship in two. But Bill Lang now thinks otherwise. According to him, the new data paints a different picture. On the drained ocean floor are all the clues he needs. To Bill's trained eye, there's nothing random about the patterns of the debris field. Like blood spatters at a crime scene, they tell a story. Now flooded in daylight for the first time, with every last corner scanned and analyzed, he can work out how the Titanic really sank.
It's going to tell us a lot more about what happened to the ship after it left the surface, made this 2.5-mile descent to the seafloor, and hopefully tell us more about what happened to Titanic during its breakup.
For Bill, the new images of the exposed ocean floor make a key piece of evidence visible for the first time. It's the overall scale of the debris field. The new survey definitively maps the site. Investigators can now see its precise dimensions. Not quite the size they expected.
I think the site really isn't that big when you consider the size of the ship. I mean, we've got a almost 1,000-foot long ship that's in 2 square miles.
If the ship had fully separated on the surface, Bill thinks there'd be a much larger scatter area.
Considering that it fell a few miles through the water column, I think that the scattering of artifacts is rather small.
The lower in the water the separation, the less distance for debris to spread out as it falls, and the more compact the pattern on the ocean floor. It's a straightforward argument, and for Bill, it's evidence the ship separated much deeper in the water than previously thought. It's the only way he can explain this small scatter pattern.
One of the most important things I think that's come out of this is that the ship may not have broken up as fast and as shallow as what was originally thought.
But when the theory is checked against the memories of eyewitnesses, their accounts vary. Some survivors recalled the ship breaking in half, while others remember the funnels falling away. Bill and his colleagues around the country have much more work to do before they arrive at final proof. But in their view, there's simply no other way to explain the evidence. With powerful new theories, the investigation is beginning to pay off. The mountain of data from the expedition has allowed us to drain the ocean and create a new view where we can spot clues others may have missed. Clues that are bringing the final mysteries of the Titanic into crisp focus. While investigators now have a sharper understanding of the history of the wreck, there's one key mystery they still hope to unravel. What will happen to the Titanic in the future? This is the exposed Titanic as she looks today after a century of decay in the dark depths.
Clearly, it's not the same site that was discovered. And yet, for all of that, as Titanic slowly changes, it remains Titanic.
In the 30-plus years since she was found, no one's been able to see her quite like this. As Titanic investigators study the model, expedition data, and video, it's becoming ever clearer that month by month, year by year, the ship is disappearing. And it's happening faster than some experts expected.
Showing its wear, its age. There's places on the superstructure, the cabin's quarters, for instance, where it looks like you can actually poke your finger through the hull itself. The hull's gotten that thin, it's just rusted away.
P.H. Nargeolet has been going to the wreck for 3 decades, and he agrees there's been a big change over time.
The distance between the A deck and the B deck was easily 10 feet, now is 5-6 feet. And step by step, the deterioration is going close to the bridge. Soon, all the decks will collapse on each other, and everything inside will be lost forever.
Investigators want to know why it's happening so fast. At these depths, there's very little oxygen in the water, so metal should rust extremely slowly. Yet on the expedition footage, they can clearly see the ship caked in weird formations that certainly look like some kind of rust. They even call them rusticles.
I was absolutely stunned by the size, the colors. They're very orange and brown, and yet when you're close to them, they're greens and purples and reds and yellows and every color of the rainbow.
In the lab, they X-ray pieces of rusticle recovered from the ship. What they find inside isn't what might be expected. This is no ordinary rust.
The structure inside this hard-looking shell is extremely fragile. They're filled with millions of ducts and tunnels and passageways and all of these little cavities, and all sorts of nutrients are stored in there.
For the microbiologist on the team, it's crystal clear. The rusticles are formed by living organisms. And when they run further tests, there's no doubt what these organisms are. Bacteria.
We found 5 different communities of bacteria living inside a rusticle, and then you've got another community living on the outside. Makes them a very complex little beast.
Some of these little beasts are anaerobic bacteria, life forms that don't need oxygen to survive. Instead, for their energy supply, they extract iron and minerals from the ship's metalwork. Like a swarm of microscopic piranhas, billions upon billions of them are feeding on the wreck.
The impact of the rusticles on this extremely large ship is overwhelming.
By studying these tiny creatures, the microbiologists believe they can now confidently lay down a time frame for the Titanic's final destruction.
If we went back in 500 years, Titanic would look fairly similar to what the bow section looks right now as far as the hull would be. It would still be a very U-shaped, very formal looking docked ship. However, I would expect that a lot of the promenade at deck would have fallen onto itself. If we were to revisit Titanic in 1,000 years, I would not be able to tell sort of the size of the magnificent ship that she is today. If you revisited the stern section, you would see that the deterioration had greatly increased simply because the damage that section had sustained during the sinking. The bacteria would have taken girders and basically have encrusted them in rusticles and deteriorated to the point of being a pile of iron ore at the bottom of the seafloor.
Long before that happens, the Titanic's custodians will have to make tough decisions.
What do we do? Do we stand by and allow the bow section to collapse upon itself? Or in the future, do we actually design some projects for recovery of certain types of artifacts from the bow section?
But any suggestion of bringing up more artifacts is controversial. For some descendants of those who lost their lives, this is a gravesite and should be left alone.
I think probably most of the survivors themselves would probably rather have seen the artifacts left at the ocean floor. Maybe those things were a reminder to them, I don't know.
However badly the Titanic deteriorates, one thing is certain. Thanks to the new science, much of the ship can never now be lost. Good news for the millions throughout the world for whom the Titanic story still lives on.
Why does Titanic continue to matter? It wasn't just a ship on a maiden voyage. It was everybody who was on it. It was a ship of dreams. It was a practically unsinkable ship. It was a ship in which a variety of stories played out, where you can picture yourself there.
Now this iconic ship and its emotional cargo can be protected forever. Every inch of the wreck inside the perimeter has been scanned and analyzed. Every known artifact logged, mapped and captured in this digital duplicate world that will never erode. Frozen in time, we can see and study the wreck like never before. In broad daylight, explorers now and in the future can continue their investigation here on the drained ocean floor, where the Titanic rests.